So, as I mentioned earlier, we are going to be thinking about covenants, those binding promises and commitments that God enters into with his people. And it is an amazing thing that the God of creation, the God of eternity, has such a deep love for and interest in the humanity that he created, that he wants to live in deeply committed relationship with them. And it's worth just taking a moment to reflect on that, to recognize that, to wonder at it, to rejoice in it. This is not a God who keeps himself aloof, but a God who comes down and lives in the reality of daily life. We see that perfectly demonstrated in Jesus. It's something that we experience day by day. And it's something to rejoice in and be thankful for. The first time the word covenant appears in our Bibles is in Genesis 6, verse 18. So we're going to start there. It's a couple of chapters before what June read to us. But it's the first time we come across this particular word. Let me remind you of the story up to this point. God has created the physical universe in which we live and pronounced it very good. God has created humanity in his image to be stewards of his creation, to be his representatives, to carry on the work that God had started. That first couple who were created were deceived and corrupted by a talking serpent, resulting in them being banished from the perfect garden in which they were living. Humanity had expanded and started to populate the earth, but were judged by God to be evil and wicked, resulting in God getting to that point where he regretted that he'd made humanity and decided to destroy it, along with the animals, birds, and so on, through a devastating flood. We find this in Genesis 6, 5-7. A story that started so well, but it reached a terrible moment. And there's lots we could say about many aspects of that story, but our focus this morning is on what happens next. Because we start to see a glimmer of hope as the story turns its focus away from those who were sinful and causing grief to God, to Noah. Someone who is described as having found favor in God's sight. Someone whom God was going to bring through the upcoming destruction. God tells him to build a large boat that was designed to keep his family and representatives of the animal kingdom alive. And it's at this point that we start to hear about a covenant, where God says this to Noah: I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives, with you. So here, God wasn't actually setting up the covenant, but a promise to Noah that it was something he would do in the future. A guarantee that they would survive what was coming. That on the other side of this devastation, there was hope. Something to cling on to when things looked dark and difficult. The flood happens. Noah and his family come safely through it, and sometime later, they emerge onto land once again. And it's in Genesis 9 that June read to us earlier that we see the covenant actually being established. But before we get to it, and we will get to it, there's something that I believe is really important to recognize that we get in the first few verses of that chapter. Because in many ways, God is starting again with humanity, resetting them on the course that he had in store for them from the beginning. And there's a lot of similarities between what we see God saying to Noah and what we see God saying to the first people that he made. In Genesis 1:28, God called on the first men and women to be fruitful and to increase in number, to have authority over the animals, the birds, and the fish. And it does exactly the same in Genesis 9. And we're left with a question. The first humans had failed at this job that God had given them. How will Noah and his descendants do? As we look back over thousands of years of history, we might conclude we haven't done all that well, although there's some things that humanity has done that has been a real blessing. There is one significant change, incidentally, between Genesis 1 and Genesis 9 in this area, where it's to do with what people can eat. In Genesis 1:29, God tells humanity that their food is to be exclusively plant-based, plants and fruit. Here in Genesis 9:3, this is extended so that humans are now allowed by God to eat meat. And I am not getting into a discussion about the merits of different diet choices this morning. I'm just pointing out that it changed at that point. But God does introduce some conditions about meat should be used, and he goes on to talk about the value of human life. He says this: "Whoever sheds human blood, by human shall their blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made mankind." And here we get a restatement of the fact that humanity has been made by God in God's image. Again, restating something that was said in Genesis 1. We're all made in God's image. I know there's lots of debate about what that means, but it does say something about the value that God places on each one of us. And this statement in Genesis 9 is made after Adam and Eve sinned in the garden that we read about in Genesis 3. So it seems that that event did not change our fundamental identity of being made in the image of God, and so being valuable and significant to him and to each other. Yes, if we're willing to admit it to ourselves, we know that we don't always behave as though we're in the image of God, his representatives, his stewards. But it does not change the reality that we are, even if somewhat tainted. Think about a coin with the Queen's head on it. It's a topical thing to think about at the moment. It might be slightly tarnished, might be worse for wear, but it still carries her image. And the important thing this reminds me is that we will never meet a person who has not been created in God's image. And this should challenge us to think about how we think about each other and how we act towards each other. When we think about our families, even those family members who wind us up. When we think about those in our church family and decide how to act towards them. When we think about our response to refugees and those who are seeking help and support. When we think about those who are struggling through the cost of living crisis that we are all in. When we think about people we meet who are not living the way that we think is right. All of these, everyone, is made in the image of God. That's something to reflect on, something to affect how we behave. Because whoever we meet is loved by God, is made in God's image. And with that, let's actually come to look at this covenant that God makes with Noah. What is involved? What are its key components? And there are a number of things that I find absolutely fascinating and exciting about this covenant. And one of those is the scope. Who and what was included. And the idea in the verses that June read continues to be repeated. In verse 9 and 10, it says that it's extended to Noah and all who would come after him, to every living creature on earth. Verse 16, it restates that. The covenant is with all living creatures of every kind on the earth. And the last thing that God says about it in verse 17 is that the covenant was established between God and all life on earth. I think we're supposed to get the idea that this extended to everyone and everything. No one is left out. And it wasn't just in the time of Noah, it's for all time. This is a covenant that God entered into with humanity, with people like us. Now, in some of the later covenants that we're going to look at, we'll see a much narrower focus, with them being with individuals, with families, with nations. But this first one is for everyone. But there's also what the covenant contains, what is committed within it. I think this is hugely encouraging. Basically, God is saying that even though he had brought the flood to destroy the wickedness that he saw around him, he was never going to do that again. Verse 11, I establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. And then God says that there's going to be a rainbow he's going to place in the sky to be a reminder that this covenant is in place, that this is the commitment that God has made. Now, we could look at this and ask, but what if things got really bad again? Would God choose to use some other means, not a flood, to do the same thing? But if we go back into the previous chapter, chapter 8, where Noah is making a sacrifice to God, we see that God seems to rule that possibility out as well. In verse 21, the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and said in his heart, never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood. And never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done. It was not that the human condition has changed. This verse makes clear humanity was still inclined to be evil and to do things that would displease God and harm society. The flood did not change human nature. But God's response to it is going to be different. God is choosing to engage in the long-term project of restoring his creation so that it's all living perfectly under his authority and in line with his good plans for it and for us. And as we will see in later covenants, they are designed to help move that plan forward. It's wonderful to know that God will not give up on us, but will continue to work towards a renewed creation. A renewed creation that is possible because of the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. The one who is going to finally restore God's creation and to usher in God's kingdom. Now, one of the things we will see in many of the later covenants is that there are commitments made on both sides. This was how they normally worked. Two parties come together. One says, I will do this for you, and the other says, I will do this for you. And most of the covenants we will come across, do the same thing. God commits himself to a person, to a family, to a nation, to a king, and he expects certain things of them in return. It's the basis of these covenants. But in this case, in this first covenant, it is totally one-sided. God is making a commitment about how he is going to act toward all of humanity. And there is nothing that is particularly requested of humanity in response. It is a totally free gift, given generously and graciously by God, with no strings attached. Such a gift from such a loving God should surely cause us to live in ways that seek to please him, but there is no specific requirement given for people to do so. Even if people totally turn against and reject God, as so many do, this promise from God still applies. I think it's a fascinating covenant that God enters into, where he commits himself in such uncompromising terms to humanity. But what does this mean for us today? It was a promise given to one man, to Noah, and to his sons, to his family, but one that had implications for the whole world and continues to have implications for us today. It reminds us that God is in ultimate control over his world and has not given up on us. And that is such a comforting thought at all times. And even when times are hard and we don't know where to turn, it is still true, even though there is a terrible war in Ukraine. It is still true, even though the cost of living is escalating terribly. It is still true, as many people around the world and in this country continue to struggle with COVID and the long-term impact of that. It is still true as we go through particular difficulties and challenges in life. It does not stop these things happening. But we can be confident that God is willing and available to walk these difficult roads with us because he has committed himself to us. And it's interesting to see that this covenant with Noah and the Noah story is picked up again a couple of times later in the Bible. It's actually picked up a few more times than that. We're just going to think about two of them and to think about its implications for us. One is in Isaiah 54, verses 9 and 10. It says this, God is speaking, "To me, this is like the days of Noah, when I swore that the waters of Noah would never again cover the earth. So now I have sworn not to be angry with you, never to rebuke you again. Though the mountains be shaken and the hills be removed, yet my unfailing love for you will not be shaken, nor my covenant of peace be removed, says the Lord who has compassion on you." And now here, God is speaking to his people in exile. They'd been carried away captive due to turning away from him for centuries, and he's reflecting on their situation in the light of the promise he made to Noah. And he once again chooses to not be angry with his people. He will continue to love them. He will continue to live in covenant relationship with them. The covenant with Noah reminds us that God is faithful to the promises he has given. Such a wonderful reality to reflect on and to hold on to. Even if sometimes that might be all we have as we go through difficult times in our lives. But the story of Noah also reminds us that God has not yet finished with his creation. It's a big thing. He entered into it in a powerful way when Jesus was born, and through the life and the death and resurrection of Jesus, it is now possible for us to once again fully enter into the covenant relationship God desires with us. But there is a coming time when this same Jesus will return to bring this period that we are living in now to an end. And Jesus spoke about that while he was here on earth by reflecting on what happened in the time of Noah. And we find this in Matthew 24. As it was in the days of Noah, Jesus says, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. This is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. It's part of a fascinating and complicated passage that we don't have time to go into in any detail now. But Jesus is referring to himself, as he often does, as the Son of Man. He's looking forward to a time when he will return, a time after his death, after his resurrection, after his return to heaven, a time that is still in our future. And it is so easy to get caught up in the daily routine of life, even its unexpected twists and turns, and cease to live in the reality of the fact that one day Jesus will return to usher in God's kingdom, to fully restore creation, to welcome his people to be fully with him, to pronounce judgment on those who have refused to have anything to do with him. People in the time of Noah just would not have understood why Noah was building his boat. There may have been many conversations about what he was doing and why, but they expected things to continue as they always had done. Then the flood came and everything changed. The story of Noah, as Jesus uses it, reminds us that one day Jesus will return at a time of his Father's choosing to finish the work that he started of seeing God's kingdom come, God's will being done on earth as it is in heaven. As God's covenant people who still live under that covenant promise that God gave to Noah, we can rejoice that whatever we are going through, God is faithful and extends his love to us. That this life is not all that there is. There is a day coming when Jesus will return and call us to be with him. So as we think about this story, let's live in the reality that God is still in ultimate authority over his world, even as many things happen in it that displease him. Let's live in the reality that God will never let us go. Let's live in the reality that one day Jesus will return. And secure in that knowledge, secure in our identity, secure in our God, let's be even more urgent and intentional to speak with others about Jesus so that they will come to know him for themselves, to experience the riches of God's love, and be looking forward to welcoming Jesus when he returns. We're going to pray, and then I've got some questions for you to think about for a few moments.